Hello guys and welcome to the stream. I knew this was supposed to be live, but because of some internet issues that I had here in South Africa, we had to pre-record this, and I'll upload this on my channel soon. So I've got a very interesting guest here, Dr. Steve Turley. He's also a YouTuber that I recently found, but I absolutely fell in love with the content that he's making. I know some of my fans even pointed him out to me. And they told me, look, this is the future you. This is a more, experienced at life, more intelligent, more learned version of yourself. Maybe one day, if you read a couple of hundred more books, you'll become like him. So the reason I got Dr. Steve Turley on my channel is because there are some parties in Europe that have always been supportive of our cause here in South Africa. Those of you who've been viewing my channel will know about the problems that we are facing, and those of you who are viewing this on Dr. Steve's channel, I invite you to come check out my channel. I'm sure there'll be a link in the description. Also, for you guys who follow me, I'll leave a link in the description to Dr. Turley's channel, and I would urge you to go check it out. It is wonderful. Dr. Steve is very positive and very optimistic always about the rise of the new nationalist populist right in Europe. Now, these parties, for example, the Alternatief für Deutschland in Germany and the Partij voor de Vrijheid in the Netherlands, have been supportive of the Boer cause ever since they entered politics. And I'm talking about times when these parties didn't even have a single seat in parliament. For example, the second in command at the Partij voor de Vrijheid, Martin Bonsma, even wrote a whole book called Minderheid in Eigen Land, which translates to minority in your own country, in which he explains the fate of the Boers in South Africa, and also how this will be the eventual fate of the West, including America, Canada, and Europe, if we don't do something about it. I think this is quite a lengthy introduction to Dr. Turley. Dr. Turley, very welcome to my channel.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's great. And I have to say, that introduction you gave me, that was the kindest way of calling a person old I've ever heard. So, no, I'm...
Yeah, well.
But I am feeling it. With every book you read, you get a little bit older. So no, it's great to be with you.
Thank you very much for being here. I want to fall in with this question, Dr. Turley. You are very knowledgeable on the rise of nationalism in Europe. What makes you so optimistic that this is the future of the West?
Several things, Willem. And we could develop them in greater detail. I would say there's few key identifying markers to show where the larger trajectories are going. So I'm looking much more at the long-term trends and trying to understand the micro events in relation to that. Some of those trends, for example, would be, I think most importantly, the death of modernity, the philosophical death of modernity. Modernity was started in the 18th, grew into the 19th century, was this notion that there is a one-size-fits-all scientific rationalist system that can be superimposed on all cultures and all nations, all times, all places, as the one true way of understanding reality. And basically, we had three outworkings of that. Political outworking in terms of Western democracy, or liberal democracy more specifically. We had an economic outworking of that in the form of communism. And then we had a kind of pseudo-cultural outworking of that in terms of fascism. Fascism got beaten up in World War II. Communism dies in Christmas of '91 with the whole Soviet
in South Africa.
Union. Yeah, no, granted. You've got what's so fascinating with it is that pushes us in a different direction. What's so fascinating with it is that actually the communism now has collapsed into a cultural Marxism, being more and more identified with race and ethno-nationalism. So what was once considered a very left-wing belief system is now actually becoming kind of an ethno-nationalist right-wing form of political theory. So I like to point out to people here in the United States that Black Lives Matter is more alt-right than Richard Spencer. Black Lives Matter is considered to be, a hard left organization. And yet, what are they drawing from in terms of their basic frames of reference for understanding the world? A thoroughgoing ethno-nationalism, a thoroughgoing ethnic supremacy, as it were. And so what you're seeing is, and this fits into it, is basically these one-size-fits-all structures just collapsing. They're falling apart. And this is largely because of the death of modernity. We just don't believe in a one-size-fits-all scientific rationalist worldview for all people, for all times, for all places. Postmodernity tends to push more this notion of pluralism and multiculturalism and blah, blah, blah. But that, even in of itself, is starting to collapse more into a tribalism. So you've got two choices now. Either you're going to have a renewed civic nationalism that's going to hold various tribes together, as it were, into a single unifying culture, or you're going to balkanize. You're going to break up into all these various ethno-nationalisms that require their own borders, their own boundaries. Since 1991, we've seen 35 nations added to the world map. We've never seen such a quick carving up of the world map as we have today. And that's indicative of the breakup of this one meta-narrative that gave us this globalization, this modernist notion of globalization. So I'd say that's the first one. The second one is globalization is still around, though philosophically it's died in terms of modernity. The elites that are in power still in politics, economics, education, and media still try to export modernity in the form of globalization. And that's producing a massive backlash because it's not only philosophically died, but globalization's creating what scholars notice three major insecurities: border insecurity, since our borders are no longer being enforced; economic insecurity, since we no longer have any kind of economic local control. Everything's in these transnational processes and experiencing these massive corrections like we saw in 2008. And of course, increasingly cultural insecurity, where the massive immigration is now redefining nations, cultures, customs, traditions that have been so precious for so many centuries. So those three insecurities aren't disappearing. If anything, they're intensifying, and they're only provoking more of a backlash. And then a third one, I would, I'll do two more. A third one of why we're moving in a nationalist, populist, traditionalist direction is the religious resurgence that's going on all over the world right now as we speak. This is gigantic. Scholars like Rodney Stark are writing about it. Eric Kaufman, a London demographer, is writing about it. We have actually never seen the resurgence of religion like we're seeing right now, quite literally all over the world. You look at the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party in India. India was once the model secular nation. Same with Turkey, Erdogan's Turkey. Turkey was once the model secular nation. They are both thoroughly religious nationalist as we speak. The Bharatiya Janata Party is the largest democratic party in the world, and they are a thoroughly right-wing Hindu nationalist party that's implementing something called Hindutva, which is, for lack of a better term, it's basically a Hindu version of Sharia law, all throughout their politics, economics, education, and media structures. China is going through two revivals right now: a Confucian revival among its Politburo and its political elite, and a Christian revival primarily among its urbanites right now. And now they're competing as to who's really more Chinese, who's more true to to a thoroughly Chinese vision. Shintoism is on the rise, particularly imperial Shintoism and highest forms of Japanese government. In sub-Saharan Africa, the Christians are growing. The Christian population is growing faster than population growth itself, evidencing extraordinary amounts of conversions. Evangelicals were 5% of Latin American population in the 1970s. Today, they're hitting 25%. They helped put Jair Bolsonaro in office of late. There are clear political ramifications, and we're even seeing it in Europe, particularly even Western Europe,
Wow, that's not
where
something I would have
largely,
even guessed.
yeah, and largely through, and that brings us to the fourth one, largely through demography. I forget what the statistic is, but something like 70% of all French children are born to basically 20% of women, French women.
Oh,
And they tend to be very, yeah, they tend to be very conservative Catholic. Christian families, very conservative, very devout Christian families see children as a blessing into the Lord. Laestadian Lutherans are having, on average, 4 children to every secular 1 child. Orthodox Calvinists are having 2 children for every 1 secular child. And so you have demographers like Eric Kaufman saying we are literally decades away, not centuries, but decades away from conservative Christians tipping the balance just through pure demography for a much, much more conservative world. So I would say those are 4 trajectories that give me a lot of confidence that that's where we're moving. And then I tend to look at individual events in light of those 4 trajectories.
well, that was a very, very long answer that you gave me there. I'm gonna, let's say, pick it apart little by little, and I want to start with one thing. The first thing that I want to start with is that you said that we have a choice between a more hardline ethnic nationalism and then a more civic nationalism. Now, the question that I have for you is, do you think there's any sort of future in this long-term thing or this long-term idea for civic nationalism? And the reason why I ask you this is because I want to link it to something else that you said. You talked about Black Lives Matter being a hardline ethno-nationalist organization, and I want to link that to a previous video where you actually talked about South Africa, and you talked about Julius Malema, and you called him a black nationalist. Well, I was a bit surprised when you said that because I did not see him as that from my side at all. I saw him as a hardline communist with views aligning mostly to Chairman Mao. And the reason why I say that is because he is completely driven by hatred. Hatred for white people, which is just a substitute for the bourgeoisie against the proletariat in Russia, for example, where he just substitutes the proletariat for black people in South Africa, and he says that they are being oppressed by white people, which is of course absolute nonsense. And I'll come to that in a second. And I would say nationalism is more about love for your own than hate for someone else. Now, what I want to come to is so do you think that this is going to be this civic nationalism, these people living together, is a possibility for Europe and America, or do you think we will see balkanization again? Because I can give you an example in South Africa. Julius Malema, he is always projecting this hatred towards white people, and he says that white people are oppressing black people, which is absolute nonsense because black people in South Africa have all the political power. They are the majority. There are more than 150 laws which prevents white people from buying shares in companies, even in the private sector. It's almost impossible for a white person to get a job at the government sector. It's almost impossible for a company that has a white owner to get a contract from the government, and so forth. But yet still black people are doing much worse economically. Right. And we can go into the reasons for that, and I talk about them a lot. But don't you think these things are inevitable? Won't they always be this cultural Marxist hammer from the left to hit us with when they say, look, black people and white people, or Hispanics in America and white people, are not equal as collectives on average, thus white people are the oppressor? And won't that always open the door for Marxism if we don't have ethno-nationalism?
Yes. No, this is excellent. I appreciate it so much. So, to answer it, I would try to frame it first in this bigger venues. So what I see with the collapse of modernity is I'm seeing as well the collapse for the basic framework of Marxism. So I see Marxism as an inherently modernist conception of the world. It's a one size fits all, political, economic, cultural system. And what scholars have noticed is that, the economic rising up of the proletariat against the bourgeois, it just never happened. It never happened in Europe. It never happened in Latin America like they were hoping it would. Never happened in the States or that sort of thing. So they rebranded it in the 1950s and 60s into a cultural Marxism. It's not so much the proletariat rising up against the bourgeois. Now it's the third world, global south, rising up against the finance centers of the first world, global north, as it were. And as such, it's begun to adopt the language of the, shall we say, the darker side, as it were, of the ethno-nationalist right. I'm with you. I think I love what you said. Nationalism is fundamentally about a love of people. I lock my doors at night, not because I hate the people outside my house, but because I love the people inside.
Exactly, yeah.
I'll be happy to invite all kinds of people from the outside, provided that they respect my house, my rules, my front door, you name it. We're all about that.
And also they leave when you want them to leave. When they overstay their welcome.
Nobody likes a guest that just won't leave. That's right. Making toll calls from your phone, smoking, and you got it. You got it. So that's what I think you're seeing instead now is the revamping, ironically, of the left into a very angry, horrid version of the right. The way I'm seeing the world moving is it's breaking up into two forms of the right. On the one hand, perhaps better, three forms. On the one hand, you have civic nationalism, and I think a very right and a very good ethno-nationalism, perhaps like what we're seeing in Northern Sudan versus Southern Sudan, what we saw in India versus Pakistan. The sense of, look, we're different religions, we have different histories, we just can't live together anymore. Maybe something like what Northern Nigeria and Southern Nigeria are going through. Something akin to that, no problem. We're just not compatible. We're going to move on, that kind of thing. Versus on the other side, exactly what you're talking about. So this Julius Malema hardcore ethno-nationalism that adopts the language.
Well, as I say, I still don't agree with him being a hardcore ethno-nationalist. Because as I said, it's just.
But that's why I'm trying to. He's an ethno-nationalist in the way I'm framing it.
Oh, I get you.
That you see. So modernist Marxism is dead, and now it's breaking up into a postmodernist Marxism. And a postmodernist Marxism is going to draw from this cultural Marxism that ironically draws from, on the one hand, ethno-centered language, but on the other hand, and you caught it, power distribution, Marxist power distribution language. And as long as they're operating from that vantage point, you bet it's never going to end. It will never have any resolution. I remember listening to this guy, Brandon Straka, I think is his name. Or did you come across this? It's something in the States called the Walk Away movement. Did you come across that at all?
I'm aware of that, yeah.
Yeah, so Brandon Straka is this gay white male, okay? He's a hairdresser, your quintessential gay white male. And I have not seen it, but he talks about it often. You can actually see a video of him crying the day after Trump won the election because he wanted Hillary to win so bad. And then all of a sudden he started to listen to his friends say, you know what? You as a gay white male, you have the ultimate privilege. And he would say, what are you talking about? Well, first of all, you're white. Second of all, you're male. And then third of all, you're gay. And now gay is under this new cultural Marxist system, you're a protected class, right? You're one of the you're given favored status. So you get all the privileges of the first two plus the privilege of a favorite. And that's when you
Isn't
recognize
that
this
a
stuff is
very big
just
paradox?
insane, right? This stuff is just absolutely insane. It never, ever, ever ends. And so I'm with you. I don't think, as long as the cultural Marxist side is very strong, very powerful, and owns the elite institutions, media, economy, governments, and the like, education in particular, as long as they own those institutions, we're stuck with them. The key is to begin to shift, like we've been seeing in Poland, Hungary, Russia. We're starting to see in Italy, very interestingly enough. We're seeing it in the Czech Republic. We're seeing it in Bulgaria, where the key, and I think we're going to see it very soon in Brazil, the key is to begin to push them out of those positions of power and then bring in those, very similar to what Scandinavia is doing right now, bring in those who are dedicated to the preservation and protection of the heritage and the identity of a people as a single culture that then can unify all kinds of people who want to come in, but they have to accommodate themselves to this particular cultural vision. That's that civic nationalism. In Europe, it's going to have a bit more of the ethno-nationalist framework in place than it would, say, like in the United States or even Brazil. And but nevertheless, I think it's very powerful and it's very strong, and it does seem to have a way of marginalizing and pushing out the hardcore cultural Marxist left. Orban, I think you're probably familiar, just helped to start the banning of gender studies in Hungarian universities. They're just, in other words, they're just not going to be degrees anymore for them, right? So
I actually
that would
heard
be
about that from your channel.
Yeah, that would be an example of starting to push them out. The Radio Denmark has just recently signed a new contract with the government requiring Radio Denmark to present Dutch history in thoroughly Christian terms, in Christian sympathetic terms. Yeah,
that's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. So those are ways, I think, that you begin to relativize the cultural Marxism. And we are beginning to, so the first phase was starting to win some of these elections, which we're doing. Second phase now is to begin to implement sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of a cultural reconstitution, a reappropriation around this more nationalist, populist, and traditionalist vision of life.
There's actually something I want to tell you, which links to this. In South Africa, if you look at how our politicians speak, but let me first talk about America, which you all would be familiar with. People like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Maxine Waters and these people, and also the people from BuzzFeed and, these hardcore Antifa leftists. They use this language, and the moment they open their mouths, you already know these people are far leftists. They speak about things like restorative justice and so forth. And then if you look at South Africa, for example, we have this ex-public protector, Professor Thuli Madonsela, and she's very well liked by the white people here in South Africa, not because they like her politics, because I think most people are politically not aware at all, but just because she speaks English in a coherent manner which they can understand. But she speaks about these restorative social justice, and she even found a movement for restorative social justice, and they use these terms that come from America, but in South Africa this is the norm. In South Africa these things are what the majority wants. This is the center of our politics. Everything that you see now in America, and you are absolutely terrified of this being pushed into legislation and into the law, it already has happened in South Africa. And that's the problem that we see with demographic changes. And I think that if you look at the demographics of America, what will happen when white Christian people become a minority, then these things that you now see as crazy and absolute social justice warrior, fringe leftist stuff, that will become the norm. But maybe the opposite is becoming true for Europe, where they are waking up to what is busy happening and what is about to happen, and we are seeing nationalism as becoming the norm there. Something that I have realized is, since I've been politically aware and politically active, reading up on these things, actually since I've been theologically aware and theologically active and so forth, I realized that the two are interchangeable. So I jumped into a lot of politics, and all you ever see from the mainstream media and so forth is Nigel Farage is far right, Donald Trump is far right, everyone is far right, Viktor Orban is far right, Dominic Tarczynski from Poland is far right. But doesn't far right mean that you are on the fringes of the Overton window, that you are absolutely on the edge of the Overton window, you are about to fall off the Overton window, and you will become an extremist? But when these parties are in the center of the Overton window, and when this is becoming the norm, can you really call them far right anymore? And if you call these parties far right, aren't they then giving a lot of legitimacy to actual far right people? I mean, like the people with Nazi banners walking down the streets. Sure. I mean, the moment they called Donald Trump a neo-Nazi, they just said that the leader of the free world, or the biggest Western country, or the most powerful Western country, has just elected a neo-Nazi. Doesn't that give a lot of legitimacy to neo-Nazis if they say that? And I think through this narrative where the media paints every second person as far right, they are actually accelerating this process of the rise of nationalism. Have you read any Alexander Dugin, Dr. Turley?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the Russian philosopher. Yeah, Dugin is a very, very exciting scholar on the scene today.
I enjoy him a lot as well. He says that we have talked also earlier in this podcast about the three main ideologies of the past in Europe, which is fascism, communism, and liberalism.
Yeah, that's great from Dugin.
If you go into his readings, he says that we are seeing a rise of a fourth political ideology. I know that the left and even some on the basic neocon right will refer to those on the nationalist right as fascists, but it's not true. It's just not true. I mean, I've read a lot of Julius Evola and I've read Mein Kampf and everything. What we see now is completely different from the fascists of old, and that's where I want to actually ask you a question. So these fascists of old Europe during the Second World War and so forth, let's talk for instance about the British Union of Fascists under Oswald Mosley. The moment that England declared war on Germany, the pride or the nationalism towards England, the love towards England, and the I'm looking for the English word here, loyalty. The loyalty towards England through his own ideology was far greater than his loyalty to his ideology. Thus, Oswald Mosley sided with the globalists in England against the so-called fascists or National Socialists in Germany. And these are the people that the left and the neocons want to equate the new nationalist right to. But the difference that we are seeing with the new nationalist right, with Viktor Orban and Hans Christian Strache, Geert Wilders, Marine Le Pen, and these people, for example, are that they are standing together against the globalists within their own country. And this may sound like a paradox, but we are seeing a global alliance of nationalists within countries. And I think that's how the nationalist right is going to geopolitically win or be victorious over the globalists, is by within their countries standing together between countries, because we are fighting towards a common goal, which is a good goal, because we know that the globalists will destroy us. So we as nationalists from different countries have to stand together in order to defeat the globalists, and that makes it absolutely completely different from fascism as we saw before the Second World War. What would your opinion on that be? That's how I understand it, and I think that's probably the truth about the future that we are in for.
Yeah, that was beautiful, Willem. That's I mean, that was so well said. Yeah, and the only thing I would add with the comment about Le Pen and Salvini and Orban and Andre Duda and all, just sort standing together there against globalism. It's Macron and the globalists who now want a European army, for heaven's sakes. So what Macron is proposing is he's actually proposing precisely what Napoleon and Hitler and Stalin had always dreamt of doing, of basically putting all European nations subservient to a single military force, continental military force. This is the irony, and this is where I think we do have to be a little careful, but I think we have to be deliberate in reimagining our political categories. So left and right, we have to understand, is dramatically changing. And so again, for us, it was always very simple. Left is your communist, globalist, liberal, right is kind of your nationalist, populist, traditionalist. But what is happening is everyone is starting to borrow from traditional nationalist language. And so this is again going full circle. And so this is why I think these trajectories, these four trajectories that we started off with, are influencing how even the left is beginning to think about itself. In Nepal, they recently voted for communists. And when asked why they voted for the communists in power, they basically said two things. One, we're trying to chum up with China as over and against India. And two, because this is the party that's going to restore and maintain our national identity. Now, when you start thinking of a worldwide leftist political ideology being the basis for restoring your national identity, in many ways, this is what was going on and has been going on in Venezuela. The socialism draws from nationalist impulses. And so the whole notion of calling the new nationalism fascism, I wrote a book on this called The New Nationalism. The whole notion of calling them fascists just misses the point that we actually are moving beyond the modernist framework for understanding the world, either in terms of liberal democracy, fascism, and communism. And we really are moving, as Dugan would say, into a kind of fourth political age. He'll call it theory, but I see it moving more into a political age where scholars called the key identifying marker for fascism, scholars were calling palingenesis. And palingenesis is this notion of being literally reborn, and it is a cultural rebirth where you have the remaking of all human culture around a particular biogenetic racial purity. That was sort of just as liberal democracy was trying to be universal, just as communism was trying to be universal, Nazism saw itself, fascist Nazism saw itself as having to be universal to push back those two views. What we have today, and that was its modernity. What we have today instead is the death of modernity. And so now we're moving away from this globalist paradigm and back to our own cultures, our customs, our traditions, our ways of life as the basis for sustainable and enriching social order. People are rediscovering, like in Viktor Orban in Hungary, like they're doing in the Republic of Georgia, they're Russia as well. They're rediscovering the necessity of the family. They recognize that alternative lifestyles and unfettered abortion is going to kill your population. Your people group won't be around at the end of the 21st century if all you're doing is waving rainbow flags and celebrating abortuaries. They're recognizing if we want a flourishing culture, we have to have flourishing fertility. And we have flourishing fertility if we honor and revere the traditional family. So this nationalism is going back to notions like family. They're returning back to the religions. In Europe, of course, it's Christianity. So they're returning to the importance of church and the formation of a redemptive conception of a moral vision of life. They're returning to the importance of community and the importance of festival, the importance of, Poland now has proposed of making Sunday literally a weekly national holiday that proscribes against doing business on that day, restoring its sanctity. These are the things we're going back to. We're going back to church and family, community, locality, nation as mediating institutions for an enriching and flourishing humanity. That's fundamentally different than anything we really saw going on in the 20th century, whether it's liberal democracy, fascism, or communism. So I think this is very important to the restoration of I think, a much more humane vision of life.
There's actually something I want to mention about the death of modernity, and that is something from within South Africa. I'm going to start by telling you about a friend of mine who did his doctorate in theology, in missiology. What's the English word for that? The studies of missiology. I don't know what do you call the studies of preaching the gospel to infidels in English.
Missionology, is that
missionology? Exactly. So he did his doctorate in missionology, and his doctorate was basically a rejection of modernity in Christianity. He said that we can't expect the black tribes in Africa, which he focused on, to, how do I say this? Live out their religion in the same way that we as Europeans do. That was basically the essence of his doctorate, of his PhD, and he was absolutely crucified for it by the Social Justice Warrior Brigade. And
oh my!
What they basically told him is, you want religious apartheid. We can talk about apartheid or apartheid, as you guys pronounce it, for hours, but what apartheid basically was in South Africa was also a rejection of modernity. We can talk, it ended very badly, it turned out very badly, there was a lot of very bad inequalities, but what it was in essence in its beginning, let's start with the British Empire. The British Empire threw all the tribes in Africa into one land. There are 11 tribes in Africa, of which one is the Boer, who became a natural settler here in South Africa. And all these different tribes had their own different areas in which they lived, and they didn't mix. They fought amongst each other all the time, and they didn't want to mix. Then the British Empire threw them all in together in one land and said, this is now South Africa. I think it's the only country that's just called its geographical location, because there's absolutely nothing else binding this country together. We had the Boer republics, and then we had the 9 different countries of African tribes, and we had the Cape, which was a British colony before the British conquered the Boer republics. And then after this happened, 40 years after the unification of South Africa, our leaders said, okay, we need to go back to being 9 or 11 different nations again. So we'll start by us as the dominant European Christian group, helping these different tribes to rebuild their own countries, and that's how we are going to proceed until these countries are able to function on their own. Now, of course, we both know the history. These countries were not able to function on their own 30 or 40 years later, and then came the whole social justice movement from America and from Europe. There was a lot of inequality, and also one of our leaders was assassinated, and his opvolger, what's that in English? The guy that came after him, he basically said exactly what the Democrat Party in the United States are saying now. We need to bring these people into our cities, or our country, as it was known back then, the Boer Republic, which was mostly white back then, about 90% white. So then they started getting all these black people in from all the surrounding black states, in order to be very cheap labor for the white people in them. And that's basically exactly what we are seeing in California happening right now. Because
absolutely,
the South Africa that I grew up in, it's not the same anymore because minimum wages killed it. But when I was a little boy, most white families in South Africa had at least 2 or 3 full-time maids working for them. And I think that's exactly what the Democrats want for America. The people who vote for this, on a large scale and on a small scale, they want that cheap labor so that they can afford to have a maid, as a middle class family, afford to have a maid to do all their dirty works for them. And then you also have the corporatists who on a large scale push for this illegal immigration, because they want thousands of low skill and low skill, low wage employees. So when you speak about the death of modernity, I really chuckle, because we already had a rejection of modernity in South Africa, and it was called apartheid, and it didn't end out well. It didn't end up well at all. So that's why I'm thinking, what is the future then for Europe and America? How are we going to have these different peoples and different cultures, functioning in their own way, without having the exact same thing that we had in South Africa called apartheid, and have that fail just as miserably as apartheid failed in the end?
Yeah, this is the $10,000 question. This for me it really does come down to, are we going to are our cultural heritage structures strong enough to support a civic nationalism like what we're seeing in Russia, which is multi-ethnic, over 100 ethnicities in Russia, and yet they're all able to unite around this unique Russian vision of sanctity, of what it means to be Russian. So even so much so that you have Islamic imaginations for the Muslims in Russia, thinking through what does it mean to be a Russian Muslim. So it's almost like Russia comes first. In America, we like the hyphenated things like you're a Latin American or African American or gay American or whatever it is. You'll notice it's the distinctive markers that come first, and American comes second. In Russia, it seems to be it's the opposite. I'm a Russian Muslim, or I'm a Russian Orthodox, or I'm a Russian gay, or whatever it is. And so if the structures are strong enough, the foundational historical cultural structures are strong enough, then you're going to be able to create a civic nationalism that should be able to be healthy and assimilate many different cultural persuasions and the like. If, however, the cultural Marxism has knocked those structures down, I don't see any way around it. I see balkanization. I just don't see any other way around it. I see balkanization or a form of some kind of, sort of racial tyranny that Malema and others are advocating. Just no way. It just seems to me there's no way of holding it together. The nation state held together historically 16th century or 17th century onward. Nation state held together primarily through faith. So
that's also what united Europe.
Yeah, it's the whole notion of cuius regio, ius religio. Whoever's region it is, that's going to be his religion. So you were able to structure yourself and your life around a common Christian confession. And then the 18th and 19th century and the rise of the Industrial Revolution, nations began to get much more united around certain kind of legal protocols and economic protocols and civic protocols and the like. And the confessional glue began to wane. Now, for nations that can draw that confessional glue back, they seem to be primed to be able to do a very, very powerful, give a very powerful vision of civic nationalism. Hence the rise of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, for example, or even Denmark's emphasis now on Christianity and their cultural heritage places. But if it's been really disassociated and really damaged from any kind of confessional framework, it seems in the end, you just go the way of cultural Marxism and you break up. I don't know any other way. Long term, I don't know any other way of holding a nation state together. When the globalist structures are no longer in place as your meta narrative, then you're going to have to defer either to a civic or an ethnic nationalism, and the variants that come out of those things. At least that's the way I'm seeing it.
Well, I actually want to end this interview off with mentioning two things. Firstly, I'll be leading a tour of 2 Russian foreign emissaries and 5 Russian journalists here in South Africa from the 24th till the 2nd of December. So this whole interview got me thinking a lot, and I've learned a lot of new things. And you mentioning Russia now gives me this opportunity to continue this conversation with the emissaries, and then hopefully we'll get an answer from them how they are able exactly to glue together the different tribes within Russia. I would say the one thing, and this is just a theory, a hypothesis that we will test, or that I'll test by asking these people whether it's true or not, but I would say the theory is that there's not as much inequality, whether it is inequality of wealth or inequality of skill or inequality of ability. There's not as much inequality between all the different peoples of Russia as there are within the tribes in South Africa and the tribes in America. I think South Africa and America is very much the same. With the whole multicultural, I think South Africa, or the so-called Rainbow Nation, is basically exactly the goal of the whole diversity is our strength crowd in America to make out of America. So I think the difference between Russia and South Africa or America is that there's not that much inequality, and I think this inequality between the collectives, between the tribes, between the peoples, creates a perfect place for cultural Marxism to grow. It creates the perfect conditions for a populist leader like Julius Malema or Maxine Waters or Al Sharpton to rile up the masses and tell them, listen, Afro-Americans, you are poor, or you are poorer on average or as a collective than your white counterparts because white males are oppressing you. And exactly the same thing happening here in South Africa. And that's basically my theory. I don't know. Do you want to end off telling me what you think about that, and then we'll end off this interview?
Yeah, it's excellent. Again, the only thing I would caution is to think of that as a static condition. Demographics are changing, as we all know. We all know that. But interestingly enough, like we talked about here with that fourth trajectory that we've been looking at, the demographics are changing actually in favor of conservative Christian sensibilities. Now, if that happens, and again, this is interesting with your mention of Alexander Dugin, if that happens, then the issue is not even so much in terms of nationhood. The issue can become larger in terms of civilization. So if you're having problems trying to figure out what to do as a nation, those problems can actually get often at least recast and rethought of, and perhaps even reconsidered in terms of civilizational structures. So like Orthodox civilization, or a Confucian civilization, or Hindu civilization, what have you. The problem, of course, we're facing with cultural Marxism is cultural Marxism wants nothing to do with civilization. It tries to reduce everything to culture and ethnicity. And when we start looking at something like Christian civilization, and what does Christian civilization call us to? What particular vision of humanity and togetherness does Christian civilization call us to? That might be the way out of the problems we might have at more local, levels, national levels, local levels, that sort of thing. So it's going to remain to be absolutely at this point. Cultural Marxism is breeding, and it is turning. Again, for me, the way I look at it, it is turning into this kind of ethno-nationalism that is absolutist in its affirmations. It's aggressive. It's angry. It sees the other solely as oppressor. And that's galvanizing people. So the civic nationalism is galvanizing people, and this ethnic nationalism is galvanizing people. And either way, we're moving to the right, civic or ethnic. The question is, which side of the right are we going to be on in the future? That's at least the way I see things moving.
Dr. Turley, thank you very much for joining me on my channel. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed this chat a lot, and hopefully we'll do so soon again.
Absolutely, Willem. God bless you, brother.
God bless you too.